Hello everyone! In this lesson, we are going to set up custom REST API endpoints for our two like actions. One action is the ability to add a like, and the other action is the ability to remove or delete a like. Alright, now before we write the PHP to set up those custom REST API endpoints, let's begin by writing front-end JavaScript to power our user interface. What I mean by this is if you come to a professor page and you have already liked that current professor, in that case, let's interpret a click on the like box to mean that you want to delete or remove your like for that professor. On the other hand, if you visit a professor page that you have not already liked, so for example, if I visit the Meowsalot professor page, since I have not already liked this professor, let's interpret a click on the like box to mean that I want to add a like. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started. So in order to respond to click events on the like box, we need to set up some new JavaScript. So over in our text editor, within our theme folder, why don't we create a brand new JavaScript file just for this feature? So in our JS folder, and then within the modules folder, let's set up a new file. The name doesn't matter, but I'm going to name it like.js. Alright, and within this brand new file, let's say class with the name of like. And remember, I like to have 3 sections in my class. So first, let's begin with the constructor. Okay, and then right below the constructor, I like to have an events method, so events. And then right below that, I like to include any methods that I create. Alright, and then at the very bottom of this file, even below the closing curly bracket for the class, let's say export default, and then the name of the class. This will make it so we can import this file within our main JavaScript file. And just so we can test and make sure that things are working, within our constructor function, why don't we create an alert pop-up that says testing from like.js. Okay, now let's go ahead and save this file and then jump into our main script file. So just sitting in the root of our JS folder is a file named script.js. Okay, first let's go ahead and import that new file that we just created. So in this area, I will say import like from, and then just point towards that file. So look within the modules folder for like. You don't need to include the .js here. Okay, and with that imported, let's create a new instance using that class. So down here, I'll say a variable, and I will name it lowercase like, so it's different from this variable name. Set it to equal a new instance of the like class. Okay, now with this in place, if we go ahead and save this file to trigger a rebundle of our JavaScript, actually, you might want to jump over to your command line and quit your current Gulp Watch task by pressing Control-C. And I'm just going to fire Gulp Watch up once again. So this time it's watching my new like module. Cool. So now whenever you save a change to either your main script file or even if you just save a change to our new like module, that should trigger a fresh rebundle over in the command line. Cool. So if I jump back to the browser and refresh, perfect. We see that alert message saying test from like.js. So everything's working as expected. Let's go ahead and actually build out this class. So first, I know that I'm going to want to use jQuery within my class. So up at the very, very top of this file, let's say import $from quotes jQuery. Cool, so that gives us access to use the jQuery library. Now let's go ahead and set up a click event, right? So when you click on the like box, we want to do something in response. So within our events method, let's say jQuery to select the element that has a class of like box, and then let's say on, and within the on parentheses, let's say we are looking for the click event, comma, and then the next argument is what function we want to run in response. So you could imagine that maybe down here in our methods area, we could create a brand new method we could name it whatever we want, but why don't we call it our click dispatcher, parentheses, curly brackets. Okay, and then on this line, for the second argument, we just point towards this dot our click dispatcher. And while we're at it, why don't we also say dot bind this? So that way, within this method, we have an easy way of pointing towards our overall class or object. All right, now the only thing that this method, our click dispatcher, needs to be responsible for is determining whether we should send out a request to add a like or delete a like, right? Depending on whether they've already liked the current professor or not. So let me show you what I mean. Back in our code, right below this our click dispatcher method, why don't we create other methods? The first one can be named create like, parentheses, curly brackets. And then right below that, we can create another method named delete like, parentheses, curly brackets. Okay, so the entire point of this method is just to decide whether it should fire off this or this. So within our click dispatcher, let's set up an if statement, if parentheses, curly brackets. And the question is, what should our condition be? Well, when it comes to the like box, if I right click and choose inspect, remember that in our previous lesson, we set up the data attribute named data exists, and then it either equals yes or no, depending on whether the current user has already liked the current professor. So within our if statement, let's say if, and select the element that has a class of like box, and say if it has a data attribute that is named exists, and if that value equals yes, then that means the current user has already liked the current professor, so then we should interpret a click to mean they want to remove their like. So within the curly brackets for the if statement, let's say this dot delete like, right? We want to go ahead and call that method. Okay, and then right after the closing curly bracket for the if statement, let's say else, otherwise, new set of curly brackets. If this is not the case, if this evaluates to false, that means the current user has not already liked the current professor, so they probably want to create a like. So this dot create like. Okay, now before we actually build out the create and delete like methods and include the code that sends off an AJAX request, why don't we first just add test alert messages? So within create like, we can say alert create test message, and for delete like, we can say alert delete test message. Okay, now before we save this, let's be sure to scroll all the way up, and within our constructor function, we can get rid of this test alert, and in its place, let's be sure to call this dot events. So that way our event listeners get added as soon as the page loads. Okay, let's go ahead and save this. And then back on the front end, let's test it out. So on this page, I have not liked this professor yet. So if I click this, cool, we see create test message, which makes sense. I would want to create a new like. But if I go to Professor Barks a Lot, which I have already liked, in this case, if I click the button, cool, we see delete test message. So this means we are firing the right methods at the right time. And this will allow users to click this button to toggle whatever their current status for the current professor is. Now, even though this JavaScript that we just wrote technically works, whenever possible, I like to set up my JavaScript to be flexible enough that it would work even if we had multiple like boxes and multiple professors on a single page. So what I'm referring to is within our click dispatcher, when it comes to the element that we're checking to see if it has that data attribute of exists, yes or no, I don't want to hard code that to point towards an element with this class. Instead, I want it to look at the specific like box that got clicked on, in case there are multiple like boxes on the page at once. Now, luckily, remember that our event handler passes along information on which element got clicked on. So within the parentheses for our dispatcher, let's just say E, short for event. And then right above this if line, at the very beginning of this dispatcher, let's create a variable. We could name it whatever we like, but I'm going to name it current like box to indicate which box got clicked on, even though I know we only have one at the moment. And really, in this course, we're only ever going to have one like box on the page at a time. But I really want to show you how to set things up in a flexible way so you could take these concepts and really run with it and build whatever you could imagine. Anyways, let's set this new variable to equal a jQuery selector that looks for e.target, and then let's say dot closest and look for a selector of likebox. Now let me explain what this code is doing. When someone clicks on the like box, they might not actually click on the overall gray box itself. They might actually click on the heart icon or the little number. So for example, let's say they clicked on the heart icon itself. Well, in that case, e.target would be the I icon element. And the I icon element is never going to contain a data attribute of exists. So what we're saying is, whatever element got clicked on, find its closest ancestor, meaning parent or grandparent element, that matches this selector. Okay, so this line of code guarantees us that this variable will always be pointing towards the relevant like box. So now down within this code, when we are looking for the data attribute, let's get rid of this jQuery selector like box and just replace it with our variable, so current like box. I know this might seem like a lot of extra work, but trust me, in the long run, it's worth it to make your JavaScript flexible. So if you ever want to change your UI or HTML layout and have multiple elements on the same page, it will just automatically work for you. So if I save this new setup and test it out, I've already liked this professor, so if I click the box, cool, we still see our delete test message. And if I go back to meows a lot, I have not liked this professor, so this click should be interpreted as a create request. Perfect. So at this point, we've got the basics of our front-end user interface up and running. Now our next step is to adjust our create like and delete like methods so that they actually do something useful, right? Instead of just these pop-ups. So what we want each method to do is send out a request to the WordPress REST API. Except unlike our My Notes feature, when it comes to adding and deleting likes, I don't want to use the default REST API behaviors. Instead, I want to set up my own completely custom REST API endpoints. So that way we are in complete control and we can implement whatever custom logic we want. Okay, and learning how to set up custom API endpoint URLs is exactly what we're going to cover in part 2 of this lesson. So let's keep things rolling and I will see you then.